3 men tried to defile her by the river, but an Apache warrior stopped them in time. The sun hung low over the river, casting its warm golden glow over the land. The trees along the riverbank swayed gently in the evening breeze, their leaves rustling in a soft, soothing rhythm. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. It was a peaceful afternoon, the kind where time seemed to slow down and everything felt at ease. A young woman named Mary stood by the river, her dark hair tied back in a simple braid. She was bent over, scrubbing clothes in the cool water, the soft sound of her hands moving against the fabric mixing with the flow of the river. The rhythmic motion of washing soothed her, and for a moment she allowed herself to forget the worries that often clouded her mind. Mary lived a quiet life, tending to the small cabin she shared with her father on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was home. They had a small plot of land where they grew crops and raised livestock, living off what the earth provided. It was hard work, but Mary didn't mind. She was used to it. She had grown up with a strong sense of responsibility, helping her father with a chore since she was old enough to lift a bucket. Her mother had passed when she was a child, leaving her father to raise her alone. It wasn't easy, but they had always made do, supporting each other through every challenge life threw their way. As she washed the clothes, Mary's thoughts drifted back to the cabin. Her father had been ill for several weeks now, coughing terribly at night and growing weaker by the day. She had tried to tend to him as best as she could, but no matter how hard she worked or how many herbs she gathered, it seemed like nothing was helping. The worry for him sat heavy on her heart, and there were times when she felt hopeless. But she tried not to show it. Her father was a proud man, and she knew he would never accept sympathy. So she kept her fears to herself, throwing herself into her chores to keep her mind busy. The river, though, had always been her escape. It was here that she could let her thoughts wander and find peace. The rhythmic sound of the water lapping against the rocks was like a melody that calmed her restless mind. The water seemed endless, stretching out before her in a way that made her forget the troubles of the world. She had often heard stories about the river, how it was said to carry secrets, protect those who needed it, and watch over the land. Some even whispered that the river was sacred, but Mary had always found that hard to believe. Still, there was something about it, something that made her feel safe and secure, as if it held a promise of protection. But that afternoon, as she worked by the river, she would soon learn that safety could be a fleeting thing. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her concentration. At first, she thought it was her father, coming to check on her. But then she realized that the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked up. There, standing just beyond the tree line, were 3 men. Strangers. They didn't belong here. Mary's instincts flared, a chill running down her spine as she quickly assessed the situation. Her eyes darted around, looking for any sign of help. But there was no one. No one nearby to call out to. No one to run to. The nearest town was miles away, and the cabin was just as distant. The men, tall and rough-looking, were already walking towards her. "Hello, miss," one of them called out in a loud, jarring voice. His tone was harsh, and there was an unsettling edge to it. He was the tallest of the 3, with a scruffy beard and a scar running down his cheek. His eyes glinted with something she couldn't quite place, but it made her stomach turn. Mary tried to stand tall, her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her composure. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady, even though her insides felt like they were shaking. She didn't want to show fear, not to these men. She had heard of stories, rumors of women being taken advantage of by strangers passing through the area, but she had never thought it would happen to her. "Oh, nothing much, just a little conversation," the man said, his grin widening as he approached her. His companions followed closely behind him, their footsteps slow and deliberate. Mary could see the rough, calloused hands of the men, and the way they eyed her made her feel uncomfortable, like prey. She took a step back, her foot brushing the edge of the water. She didn't want to show weakness, didn't want to let them know she was scared, but her mind was racing. What could she do? She had no weapon, no means of defense. All she had was the river, and she wasn't sure how much help it could be in this situation. She could hear her heart thudding in her ears as the men drew closer, their smiles now turning into something darker. "You should be more careful, little lady," one of the other men said, his voice low and mocking. He had a rough, gravelly voice, like someone who had spent too many years shouting in the wind. "Out here all alone, no one to help you." He chuckled and his friends joined in. Mary's throat tightened, but she refused to cry out. The tall man stepped closer, his boots crunching against the rocks. "We're just passing through," he said, his eyes flicking to her face. "But you seem like someone who could use some company." The words hung in the air, thick with malice. Mary's mind spun, and for a moment all she could think about was running. But where? The men had her cornered by the river. She couldn't escape. She could fight, but she didn't know how. She had never been taught how to defend herself. Never had the chance. She swallowed hard, taking another step back. Her body tensed, ready to move if they came any closer. She wasn't going to let them hurt her, not without a fight. And then, just as the first man reached for her, the wind changed direction, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of hooves thundering across the earth. Mary's heart skipped a beat, and she looked up just in time to see a figure emerge from the trees. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a fleeting hope. But no, the figure was real. A man, tall and strong, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through the air. He was dressed in the traditional clothing of an Apache warrior, his long hair flowing in the wind behind him. The men froze. The warrior's presence was like a sudden shift in the air, a calm before the storm. He walked with purpose, his eyes never leaving the men. The tall man who had been moving toward Mary turned to face the warrior, his expression faltering as he seemed to weigh his options. The Apache warrior stopped just a few feet away from the men. He didn't say a word at first, but the silence between them spoke volumes. It was a silence that seemed to carry the weight of many years of experience. The men could see the knife sheathed at his side, the way his stance was relaxed but ready. The warrior's presence alone seemed to make the air thicker, charged with the knowledge that he was not someone to be crossed. The three men looked at each other, their confidence wavering. One of them took a step back, unsure. Another reached for his belt, but the warrior's eyes flicked to him, a silent warning that caused him to hesitate. And then, the leader of the group, the man with the scar, spoke. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice less certain now. The Apache warrior's response was simple and to the point. "Leave her." For a long moment the men said nothing. They could feel the strength of the warrior's presence pressing down on them, and their bravado started to fade. They looked at each other, then at the warrior, and something in their eyes changed. The fear was growing, but they didn't want to show it. Finally, the leader of the group let out a low growl, his anger rising. "You don't know who you're messing with." The warrior didn't flinch. "I know exactly who you are. Now leave." It was clear that the men realized they had made a grave mistake. Slowly, one by one, they backed away, their eyes still fixed on the warrior. With a final glance at Mary, they turned and fled, their retreating footsteps swallowed by the sound of the river. Mary stood there, frozen in place, as the Apache warrior watched the men disappear into the trees. The tension in the air slowly began to lift, but her heart was still racing. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure. She was safe. The warrior turned to her, his gaze soft but unwavering. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough to reassure her. The moment passed quickly, but the memory of it would stay with her forever. The three men hesitated, their eyes darting from the Apache warrior to each other, unsure of how to react. They were not accustomed to being confronted like this, especially by a figure who seemed to carry the weight of centuries in his calm, steady gaze. The air around them seemed to grow thicker, and for a moment everything stood still. The tall man with the scar on his face shifted his stance, but he didn't make a move just yet. The warrior stood with the grace of a natural-born fighter, his eyes never leaving them, his presence alone enough to make them feel small and insignificant. Mary, still trembling from the earlier fear, felt a strange sense of relief wash over her as the tension in the air began to shift. The warrior was there, and for the first time she felt like she wasn't alone. The men, who had once seemed so threatening, now seemed much less certain of themselves. They had come for something they thought they could take, but now they were faced with something far more powerful, a protector. Mary's heart still raced, but it was no longer from fear. Now it was from the overwhelming feeling that something important had just shifted, something she could not fully understand yet. The leader of the men, the one with the scar, shifted his weight, glancing over his shoulder at his companions. It was as if they were silently deciding what to do next. The warrior remained perfectly still, not moving a muscle. He stood tall, but there was no aggression in his posture, no desire for violence. His entire demeanor radiated quiet authority. It was the kind of presence that made even the most hardened criminals think twice. "Who are you?" the scarred man demanded once more, but his voice lacked the same confidence it had held moments before. The warrior's eyes never faltered, though. He didn't speak at first, letting the silence stretch long between them. It was as though the warrior knew that the very weight of his silence was enough to send a message. The leader's hand hovered near his belt, and the other two men behind him looked to each other nervously, shifting from foot to foot. The warrior's eyes followed each of their movements as if memorizing their every action. There was no hurry, no sign that he was eager for a fight. He knew what he was capable of, but he wasn't showing his hand. The silence continued. Mary's heart was still racing, but now she noticed something else. A deep sense of respect grew within her as she watched the Apache warrior. His composure, his calmness in the face of danger, it was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was as though he had already seen and survived countless moments like this. He wasn't afraid of the men, nor was he angry. He was simply standing between them and her, offering protection, and that was enough. The scarred man took a step forward, a slight sneer pulling at his lips. His hand dropped from his belt, and his voice grew louder. "You think you can stop us? You're just one man, alone in the wilderness. You don't know who we are," he spat, but the words were weak now. The power behind them had faded. The warrior did not respond to the insult. He simply stood taller, as if drawing strength from the earth beneath his feet. His expression was serene, yet it spoke volumes. He was not intimidated by empty threats. The world was his, and he knew it. "I know exactly who you are," the Apache warrior finally spoke. His voice was low, calm, and yet it carried a certain weight to it. "And I know what you've come for." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his movements graceful and deliberate. The men flinched, their bravado slipping away, but they still stood their ground. The leader's hand twitched near his belt again, but this time he didn't draw his weapon. There was something about the warrior that made him hesitate. Mary watched, mesmerized, as the two sides stood in a silent standoff. The three men, once so sure of themselves, now looked uneasy, their faces betraying their uncertainty. The Apache warrior's gaze was steady, unwavering. He looked at each man, one by one, with a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the space between them. It wasn't just his physical presence. It was something deeper, something ancient, that emanated from him. For a long moment, neither side moved. The warrior's calmness seemed to affect the men. They began to look less like the threatening figures they had been just moments ago, and more like cornered animals, unsure of their next move. The warrior's gaze never wavered. He stood perfectly still, as if he were waiting for them to make the next move. But it was clear that he was prepared for whatever they chose. His eyes flicked briefly to Mary, a silent reassurance that she was safe, and then returned to the men. One of the men, who had been standing quietly behind the leader, shifted his weight nervously.
"I don't think we should be messing with him," he muttered under his breath.
His voice was barely audible, but the other men heard it, and the words seemed to hit them with the weight of a warning. The leader of the group glared at the man who had spoken, but his anger was weak, diluted by the growing realization that they were outmatched. He turned his attention back to the warrior, his voice now laced with uncertainty. "We don't want trouble," he said, though the words sounded forced, as if he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "We were just having a little fun," There's no need for things to get out of hand. The warrior remained silent for a moment, watching them carefully. His eyes narrowed just slightly, as though he were reading them, understanding their fear, their hesitation. He had no need for violence. He simply needed to ensure that Mary was safe. And that in itself was enough to turn the tide of the situation. Finally, the Apache warrior spoke again, his voice steady but firm. "You will leave now, or I will ensure that you do." His words hung in the air, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. The men could feel the weight of his words in their bones. There was no argument left in them. It was clear that this was a man of honor, a protector, and they would be wise to heed his warning. The leader of the men looked at his companions, and they all exchanged nervous glances. Slowly, the leader's shoulders slumped in defeat. He let out a heavy sigh and nodded to his companions. Without another word, the three men turned and began to retreat, their earlier bravado completely gone. They had come with one purpose in mind, but the warrior had made it clear that their mission would fail. Mary stood in stunned silence as the men disappeared into the trees. It wasn't until they were gone that she let out the breath she had been holding. Her legs felt weak, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse into the dirt. But she stayed upright, her hands trembling from the rush of emotions that flooded through her. The warrior didn't move immediately. He watched the men vanish into the distance, his eyes never straying from their retreating forms. Only when he was sure they were gone did he turn back to Mary, his gaze softening just slightly. He stepped closer to her, his expression unreadable, but his presence still offered a sense of calm and protection. Mary could hardly find her voice, but she managed to whisper, a soft thank you. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she could muster. The warrior didn't reply at first. He simply nodded once, a small gesture that carried with it more meaning than words ever could. Then, without another glance, he turned and began to walk away, his figure blending into the trees as silently as he had appeared. Mary stood there for a long time, her heart still racing, her mind reeling. She had been saved. The danger had passed, but the memory of the warrior's presence, his calm, unwavering protection, would stay with her forever. Mary stood still for a long time after the Apache warrior disappeared into the trees. The sounds of the forest returned, but they felt different now, quieter, softer, as though the world around her was holding its breath. The weight of what had just happened sank in, and she felt her legs weaken, as though they might give way beneath her. She quickly found a nearby rock to sit on, trying to steady herself. Her heart was still racing, but it wasn't from fear anymore. Now it was from an overwhelming mix of gratitude and awe. She looked out at the river, the water now calm after the unsettling moment that had nearly changed her life. The day had started out so peaceful, the sun shining brightly over the land, the gentle current of the river flowing like it always did. Now it felt like an entirely different world, one where she had almost been lost to the darkness of strangers, only to be saved by someone she didn't even know. The warrior's figure still burned in her mind, strong, silent, and unmovable like a force of nature that had appeared when she needed it most. What puzzled Mary more than anything was that she had never seen him before. She had lived in this area her whole life, and though she had heard stories of the Apache people and their warriors, she had never expected to meet one. She wondered who he was. What brought him to this part of the river at the exact moment she needed help? Was it fate? Or had he been watching over her all along, waiting for the right time to intervene? Her thoughts swirled, and she found it hard to concentrate. She tried to push the questions aside, but they kept coming back, relentless. Who was he? Where had he come from? Why had he come to her rescue? So many thoughts, but no answers. It was hard to make sense of something so mysterious. She shook her head slightly, trying to clear the confusion. It wasn't the time for questions. She had been saved, and that was enough for now. As she sat there, gathering her thoughts, she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from a quiet moment by the river, but the kind that came from knowing someone was looking out for you, even when you didn't know it. Mary had always been independent, raised by her father to rely on herself. But in that moment she realized something. No one was truly alone. She had been rescued not just by the warrior, but by something greater, something that made her believe that the world had a way of balancing itself out, of sending help when it was needed the most. The sounds of the forest began to feel more natural again, and the tension that had gripped her earlier slowly began to fade. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. The air had cooled, and a slight breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. Mary stood up, brushing the dirt off her skirts, and slowly made her way back to the water's edge. She couldn't just sit there forever. There was work to be done, and her father needed her at the cabin. As she walked back to the small cabin she shared with her father, her thoughts kept drifting back to the warrior. What had he seen in her that had made him step in to help? Was it just the right thing to do, or was there something more? The more she thought about it, the more questions she had. But one thing was certain: she would never forget him. When she reached the cabin, the warm glow of the fire inside welcomed her. The smell of stew filled the air, and she could hear her father's voice, soft but steady, calling out to her from inside. She stepped through the door and found him sitting by the hearth, his face lined with worry, but his eyes bright with recognition as he saw her. "Mary, where have you been?" he asked, his voice a little raspy from the illness that had plagued him for weeks. His brow furrowed as he looked at her, noticing her pale face and the faraway look in her eyes. "You've been gone longer than usual. Is everything all right?" Mary smiled at him, her heart swelling with love for her father. She had always been the one to take care of him, but today it felt like he had been the one looking after her, even though he didn't know it. "I'm fine, Pa," she said, sitting down beside him. "Just needed some time by the river. It's peaceful there." Her father gave her a knowing look, as though he could tell there was something more to the story than she was letting on. But he didn't press her. He had always respected her need for space, knowing that sometimes the quiet was the best medicine for whatever weighed on her heart. "I'm glad you're all right. You're all I've got left, Mary." "Don't forget that," he said, his voice gentle but filled with concern. "I won't forget, Pa," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She wanted to tell him everything: the men by the river, the warrior, how he had saved her. But she couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat, heavy with the weight of the memory. She wasn't sure she was ready to talk about it, and in truth, she wasn't sure she could explain it in a way that made sense. The warrior had been like a shadow, appearing out of nowhere to stop the men before they could do anything. It was as though he had always been meant to be there, waiting to protect her. Instead of speaking, she took the bowl of stew her father handed her, grateful for the warmth it provided, but even more grateful for the safety she felt now, knowing that there were people in the world, whether she knew them or not, who would step in when needed most. They ate together in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Mary found herself lost in her thoughts once more. She couldn't stop thinking about the warrior, about how his presence had calmed her in a way nothing else could. She realized now that in that brief moment, she had seen something in him that she hadn't seen in anyone else before. A quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to be loud or aggressive to make its point. It was the kind of strength that came from the land itself, rooted deep in the soil and the history of the people who had lived here for centuries. It was the strength of survival, of standing tall in the face of hardship, and of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. She finished her meal and stood up, walking to the window to look out at the fading light. The night was falling, and the stars were beginning to appear in the sky. She hadn't noticed before, but now it seemed like they were shining brighter than usual, as though they had witnessed something extraordinary. That night, as she lay in bed, the image of the Apache warrior stayed with her. She couldn't forget the calmness in his eyes, the way he had stood there, unshaken by the threats of the men. And though she didn't know his name, though she didn't know where he had gone, she knew one thing for certain. He had saved her. He had saved her from something much darker than she could have imagined. And somehow, in that moment, it felt like he had saved more than just her. He had reminded her of something important, something that she had almost forgotten in the chaos of life. That there was always hope, even in the darkest moments, and that no matter how alone we might feel, there are always people who will stand in the gap when needed. As she drifted off to sleep, the stars outside twinkling brightly above her. Mary knew that she would never forget the warrior by the river. His presence, even if fleeting, had left an indelible mark on her heart, one that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The days following the encounter by the river felt strangely different to Mary. There was a sense of calm that had settled over her life, like a weight that had been lifted. She went about her chores with a quiet confidence, as though the memory of the Apache warrior had imbued her with a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. The sounds of the river, once just a peaceful backdrop to her routine, now felt like a constant reminder that the world was full of unseen protectors, those who quietly stood watch over the land and its people. Each time Mary ventured to the river to wash clothes or gather water, she found herself looking around, half expecting to see the warrior appear from the trees, as though he might materialize at any moment. But, of course, he never did. His absence was a strange comfort, a reminder that some things were meant to be fleeting, and perhaps that was the beauty of it. It was as though he had appeared only when he was truly needed, and now that the danger had passed, he had vanished back into the shadows of the forest. But Mary couldn't forget him. She tried, but every time she stood by the river, every time she saw the setting sun cast its golden light across the land, she remembered the warrior's calm, unwavering presence. She couldn't stop thinking about how he had saved her when there seemed to be no hope, how he had appeared out of nowhere with a strength and authority that had been almost mystical. It was as if he had been there for a purpose, as if he had always been watching over her, waiting for the right moment to intervene. And that thought stayed with her. Her father's health had worsened in the weeks that followed, his coughing growing more persistent and his strength fading by the day. Mary had done everything she could, gathering herbs, cooking him nourishing soups, keeping the fire burning. But nothing seemed to ease his condition. She had heard about a healer living near the town, a woman known for her knowledge of rare remedies, but the journey was long, and Mary couldn't bear to leave her father alone for too long. She had made up her mind to go, though. She knew she had to, even if it meant leaving him for a day or two. One morning after she had prepared breakfast for her father, she packed a small satchel with provisions for the journey. She knew the path through the woods, though it wasn't always safe. It was quiet and lonely, and there had been reports of travelers being waylaid by bandits or worse, but she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The memory of the warrior's quiet strength stayed with her, and somehow it made her feel braver than she had before. She was not alone, even if she couldn't see him. She was never truly alone. As she walked along the familiar path, the forest seemed alive around her. The birds called to each other in the trees, and the rustling of leaves underfoot seemed louder in the stillness of the morning. The cool air brushed her cheeks, and the scent of pine filled her nostrils. It was a peaceful journey, and Mary found her thoughts wandering. She thought of her father and the way he had always provided for her, teaching her how to take care of herself and the land. She thought of the cabin, the life they had built together, and the years of hard work that had gone into making their little corner of the world feel like home. But then her mind returned to the warrior. His face, though she had only seen it for a brief moment, was etched in her memory. There had been something about him, something that had made him different from anyone she had ever met. It wasn't just his appearance or the way he had carried himself in the face of danger. It was the quiet confidence, the peace he exuded, even in the most tense of moments. It was a strength that didn't need to prove itself, and that Mary realized was the most powerful kind of strength of all. The journey took longer than she had anticipated. The path was rugged and winding, and the weight of the provisions on her back slowed her down. By the time she reached the edge of the town, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the sky. The town was small, with only a few buildings clustered together around a central square. There was a sense of quiet here, too, but it wasn't the same as the peace of the river or the forest. It was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes from the hustle and bustle of daily life, where everyone seemed to be in a hurry to get from one place to the next. Mary made her way to the healer's cabin, a small, unassuming structure tucked away on the edge of town. The door was slightly ajar, and she could smell the faint scent of herbs wafting from inside. She knocked gently, and the door creaked open. An older woman with graying hair and kind eyes stood in the doorway. "You must be Mary," the woman said, her voice warm but with an air of knowing. "I've been expecting you." Mary blinked in surprise. "You've been expecting me?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. The healer smiled softly. "Yes. Your father's condition is known to me. Come inside, child."
"Let me help." The inside of the cabin was cozy, with shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and vials filled with liquids of various colors.
The air was thick with the scent of lavender and eucalyptus. Mary stepped inside, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. This woman, this healer, seemed to have a gentle calm about her, much like the warrior. She felt like she could trust her without question. "I have some remedies that might help your father," the healer said, gesturing for Mary to sit down. "But first, tell me how he is. What have you tried so far?" Mary explained everything. The coughing, the weakness, the feeling that nothing was helping. The healer listened intently, nodding as Mary spoke. When she finished, the healer rose from her seat and moved to one of the shelves. She returned with a bundle of dried herbs wrapped in cloth and began to prepare a tincture for Mary's father. "Your father's illness is not uncommon," the healer said softly, "but it will take time and patience. I can give him something to ease the coughing and help him sleep, but the healing will need to come from within him." Mary nodded, her heart heavy with worry. She couldn't help but feel guilty for not being able to do more for him. She had always been the one to take care of things, but now it felt like nothing she did was enough. The healer seemed to sense her thoughts. She placed a hand on Mary's shoulder and smiled gently. "You've done everything you can, child. You are doing well. But sometimes we must let others help. That is how we heal." Mary felt a lump form in her throat. She had always been independent, had always believed that she had to carry the weight of the world on her own shoulders. But perhaps the healer was right. Perhaps it was time to let others in, to trust in the help that was offered, just as she had trusted in the warrior when he had appeared by the river. After receiving the healer's remedies, Mary made her way back home, the night having fully fallen by the time she started her journey back. The path was darker now, but the cool breeze felt refreshing. As she walked, she noticed the familiar rustling of leaves in the trees, the sounds of the forest welcoming her back, and for a brief moment she felt a sense of peace again, a peace she hadn't felt in weeks. She didn't know what the future held. Her father's condition was still uncertain, and there were so many things beyond her control. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything would be all right. The warrior's presence, the healer's wisdom, and the peace of the river. They were all part of something greater than herself. And that knowledge gave her the strength to keep moving forward, no matter what lay ahead. The days that followed felt like a blur to Mary. She spent her time caring for her father, making sure he took the remedies given to him by the healer, and keeping the small cabin in order. His condition had not improved much, but he seemed more comfortable, and that gave Mary a sense of relief. Each morning she would rise early, prepare a simple breakfast for him, and then go out to the fields or the river to do the work that had always been her responsibility. But there was something different now, a quiet awareness that she was not entirely alone in the world. The memory of the Apache warrior remained in her thoughts. She had never told anyone about what had happened by the river. There was no need to, really. Her father was too ill to understand, and the people in the small town where they lived had enough to worry about without hearing about a chance encounter in the woods. But the warrior's presence lingered in her heart. She couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, he was still watching over her, even though she hadn't seen him since that day. His calm, his quiet strength, his ability to remain unmoved in the face of danger. It had all left a mark on her, one that would not fade easily. Mary didn't tell anyone, but she began to leave small offerings by the river, a flower, a stone, a piece of bread from her table. She didn't know why, but it felt right. It felt like a way to say thank you, to honor the mysterious figure who had saved her. Each time she returned to the river, she would pause for a moment, looking around as though expecting to see him appear from the trees, but each time, he was not there. Still, she continued to leave her little offerings, The river had always been a place of peace for her, but now it held a deeper meaning, one that she couldn't explain, only feel. Days passed into weeks, and as the seasons slowly began to shift, Mary's life started to return to a rhythm of sorts. Her father's condition, though not fully healed, had stabilized, and there was a sense of hope once again in their small cabin. Mary's worries were far from gone, but she felt stronger than she had in a long time. She had learned something during those difficult days, that sometimes strength didn't come from doing everything on your own. Sometimes it came from knowing when to seek help, when to trust in others, and when to accept that there were forces at work beyond your control. It was one crisp evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a soft shade of pink and purple, that Mary decided to visit the river once more. The weight of the day's work had left her feeling weary, but she knew she needed the quiet, the space to clear her thoughts. As she walked along the familiar path, the air smelled of earth and pine, and the forest seemed alive around her. The birds had begun their evening songs, and the sound of rustling leaves was peaceful, like a lullaby from the earth itself. She had come to love these walks, where the only sound was her footsteps and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. When she reached the river, she stood for a long moment, gazing at the water as it flowed past. The soft glow of the setting sun reflected off the surface, casting golden light that danced across the rocks. Mary had often come to this spot, but today something felt different. There was a quiet stillness in the air, as if the world was holding its breath. For a brief moment she felt as though she were not alone, as though someone else was there with her, watching over her. She looked around, half expecting to see the Apache warrior, but of course, he was not there. Yet the sense of his presence was undeniable. Mary sighed softly, the feeling of being watched over both comforting and strange. She smiled to herself, the thought of the warrior still lingering in her mind. She had always thought of him as a guardian, someone sent to protect her in that moment of need. And even though he was not physically there, his influence had stayed with her, guiding her actions and thoughts. She knelt by the water's edge and placed a small bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth beside the river, a silent offering of gratitude. Her hands trembled slightly as she laid it down, but there was no fear in her heart. Instead, there was a deep sense of peace, as though she were fulfilling something important, something sacred. "I don't know who you are," she whispered softly to the river, her voice barely audible in the quiet evening air. "But thank you. I won't forget what you did for me." Mary sat there for a while longer, watching the water flow past, her thoughts drifting. It was as if the river had become a part of her, a place where she could connect with something greater than herself, something ancient and unchanging. It was a place of solace, of strength, and of quiet reflection. As the evening darkened, she rose and began to make her way back home. The path was familiar, and though the shadows were growing longer, she felt no fear. The night felt like a blanket of safety wrapped around her, and she knew, deep down, that she had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. When she arrived back at the cabin, her father was resting by the fire, his face peaceful for once. Mary quietly set about preparing a simple meal for the two of them, feeling a sense of contentment that had been absent for so long. She had done what she could, both for herself and for him, and now all she could do was hope that the days ahead would be kinder than the ones that had passed. After dinner, she sat by the fire, her thoughts quiet. He didn't feel the need to speak. There was comfort in the silence, in knowing that her father was safe for the moment, and that she had done all she could. The worries that had once consumed her no longer felt so heavy. She had learned to trust, to believe that there was more to the world than just what could be seen with the eyes. There were forces at work, both seen and unseen, that guided and protected, and sometimes those forces took the form of a quiet warrior by a river. Later that night, as Mary lay in bed, her eyes heavy with sleep, she allowed herself to dream. She dreamed of the river, of the Apache warrior, and of the strength that she had found in herself through it all. There was still much she didn't understand, but she didn't need to. The river, the warrior, the land, they had shown her something important. She was never truly alone, and the world, though it could be a difficult place, had a way of offering help when it was needed most. The next morning, Mary awoke to the sound of birds singing outside her window. The light of the new day streamed through the cracks in the shutters, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. The world outside was as it always had been, but she had changed. She had learned to believe in something greater than herself, to trust in the unseen protectors that watched over the land. And as she stepped outside ready to face another day, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had the strength to face them.